All right, well, we are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Philip Gilman. I'm a policy analyst at the Georgia Department of Community Affairs, and I'll be joined by Brittney Daise, our Housing Data and Research Specialist, and we're going to take some time to talk through the National Housing Trust Fund and DCA's process for developing the allocation plan for that new program. And we'll go ahead and start to dive in. I already introduced myself and Brittney, and we'll have our contact information available at the end as well as the National Housing Trust Fund official web email address that you can provide comments through. We are certainly open to hearing from you and hearing input. As we're still sort of getting everyone on the line, I'm going to go ahead and start doing some interactive aspects of this call. We'll have a few polls that we can put up throughout the process. I'm going to go ahead and put one up just to see who all we've got on the call. So if you'll select in what capacity you're participating in this call from some of the options we have here. 83% participation, I'll go with that for now. So as you can see on the screen, we've got some diversity certainly of attendees, whether or not it's government staff. We've got certainly quite a few nonprofit staff members, some housing developers, as well as some industry professionals. No just purely interested citizens, as I'm sure you are all interested citizens. So with that, we'll start to dive in. Starting with our overview of the webinar. Let me back up a couple slides. There we go. So today we're going to talk through the background of the National Housing Trust Fund fairly briefly. I'm sure many of you have already gotten a chance to hear about the basics of the National Housing Trust Fund, but we certainly want to cover some of that. We will talk through an overview of DCA's work so far and the timeline that we have developed tentatively for putting together and getting approval for our National Housing Trust Fund allocation plan. And then Brittney's going to take a little time to review some of the current research that DCA has received from some of our partners and is also doing. And then we have some questions that we have for both the people on the call, but ongoing as we look into this input process. There's a handful of questions that would be very helpful for organizations and individuals like yourself to have input on. And then finally, we will be looking at the Q&A process, try to see, to the extent that we can on a webinar like this, have some dialogue or at least opportunity for input. So diving in on the National Housing Trust Fund, it was established in 2008 under HERA, the Housing Economic Recovery Act, and of course sat dormant for a handful of years, but was originally created to increase or support or finance the production or preservation of affordable housing, specifically through acquisition, new construction, reconstruction, or rehabilitation of what HUD was calling non-luxury housing. And then in 2014, 6 years after the creation of the program, Mel Watt and FHFA directed Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to actually begin setting aside and allocating the funds. And soon thereafter, in 2015, HUD published the interim rule governing much of what we know of the program. Specifically, this is a program that is designed to serve what we call ELI and DLI households, or extremely low income and very low income households. Those are households that earn less than 30% of the area median income in the case of DLI, and between, that should say, 30 to 50% of area median income for very low income households. And the one thing I'll add there, until the funding for the National Housing Trust Fund, that is the funds that come from Fannie and Freddie, the GSEs, is over $1 billion, which is not the case in this year. 100% of the focus of the funding will go towards that segment of the extremely low income population, so those earning below 30% of area median income. This is a program in a lot of ways structured very similar to HUD's home program. There it is similarly distributed throughout the state, similar uses, similar eligible applicants, with a handful of major exceptions, and the two that I list here are the ones that are likely to have the largest impact on DCA's allocation plan. The first is that 80% of the funds must go to the production of affordable rental housing. So up to 10% of funds can be used for affordable home ownership, but the vast majority of the funds are really focused into the rental sector. And when you look at up to 10% of funds being used for administration of the program, that 80% is quite a large, if not the full segment. And then also we're looking at a 30-year period of affordability, which we'll talk a little bit about later. That's in contrast to the home program's either 5, 10, or 20-year period of affordability. The 30-year period of affordability is quite a bit of time, and certainly the longest statutory requirement of affordability, although there is some similarities to the low-income housing tax credit program. So there's been different estimates. HUD has not officially put out, as far as we've seen, an official estimate of how many funds will be available in year one, but the estimates we've seen have ranged between $3.34 and $3.57 million in year one in Georgia. And so while that may not be quite the size of some of the other programs, that is certainly encouraging a substantial program as we look to begin the process of developing how to deploy those funds. So overview of DCA's National Housing Trust Fund work. The first step was having the governor designate the Georgia Housing and Finance Authority, which administers the National Housing Trust Fund, and that would be through the Department of Community Affairs. So those would be synonymous in this case. The Department of Community Affairs has undertaken an analysis of impediments, which is up on a draft form on our website. We've been receiving comments on that, and that certainly is informing all of our planning and programs. And then, as Brittney will talk about here in a little while, with the support of organizations like Enterprise Community Partners and others in the state, we've been trying to get a better grasp and understanding about what exactly the ELI population, who exactly this is in Georgia, to better guide our allocation plan development. And we have certainly been reviewing HUD guidance recommendations coming out of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. I'm sure many of you may have recently been on their webinar as far as recommendations for the state, and we're certainly following those recommendations as well as different things coming from HUD. And now the stage we're in right now is the public input process. So this webinar would be the kickoff of that process. We have planned some in-person stakeholder meetings and are open to planning more as needed. Those are really opportunities to build upon some of the conversations we have here in the webinar, largely with representative organizations who can speak to some of the development realities and on-the-ground realities of how these funds may be deployed. And then as needed and as available, we are interested in conducting conference calls and phone calls and other types of public interaction as we're going through this process. Something that we would greatly appreciate is people raising their hand and recognizing, have you heard from this group? Have you heard from this organization? We don't feel as if this aspect or segment of the ELI population is being represented in this conversation, and we want to certainly be attuned to that and create opportunities to be on calls or have meetings with organizations to make sure we have a robust input process. And then, of course, we're in the very beginning stages, but we are working on the framework for our draft allocation plan and starting to put together plans for whether or not we can align that timeline-wise with our annual action plan hearing. And I'll sort of talk about that timeline here on this next slide. As many of you know, DCA does a consolidated plan of 5-year planning process, 2013 through 2017, and each year we do an annual action plan where we put together our plans for the Community Development Block Grant, The home program and the National Housing Trust Fund program will be an aspect of that, among other programs. Because of the timing this year, the National Housing Trust Fund will need to be what is known as a substantial amendment to that annual action plan process. But we've sort of tried to lay out the timeline as we see it here. So in March of this year, the GSEs transferred the funds to FHFA, and DCA is undertaking public input here in March and into April, with the goal in April of getting the actual formula allocations, hopefully, we've heard from HUD, and being able to post a draft allocation plan. And since that will be a substantial amendment to our annual action plan, there will be a 30-day review process, and we intend to have a public hearing where there's opportunities to comment, if possible, both on our annual action plan and the National Housing Trust Fund. But if those timelines don't work, then we'll certainly have two separate hearings for both the annual action plan and the National Housing Trust Fund allocation plan. So then we'll have our comment period in April and May and the hearing, and then in May we'll be revising based off comments the allocation plan and then submitting it to HUD. There's not specific guidance at this time exactly what HUD's process will be for evaluating the allocation plan, but the expectation is that it'll be a similar 45-day period, which would line us up well for the summer when grant agreements are executed and funds are provided to the state. So I'm going to turn it over here in a second to Brittney. I wanted to stop at this point to see if there's anybody. You can use the chat option, or you can hit the raised hand button if there's any questions at this time. And I can hopefully unmute you if you want to raise your hand. Otherwise, I can read out any questions that are typed into us. All right, seeing none then, I will turn this over to Brittney and give her an opportunity to talk through some of her research.
All right, thanks, Philip. So within the next couple of slides, I plan to discuss research on Georgia housing cost burden households. I'll look at the ELI income limits as well as the levels. I will give a brief profile of the Georgia ELI households as well as the individuals, and then we'll take a look at the total affordable and available rental units. Based on what is shown, the majority of the ELI households in Georgia are severely cost burdened. This basically means that the households pay more than 50% of their income on housing costs. This alone makes up 80% of the ELI population in Georgia and accounts for roughly 400,000 households. Although the severely house cost burden aspect is important, it's also important to look at the housing cost burden category, which makes up roughly 58,000 households, and those are the individuals that pay between 30 and 49% of their income on housing costs. Here we can see the percent within each income category that are deemed severe housing cost burden. From what we can actually see here, if you look at Georgia, 81% of the income levels are at or below 30% of the AMI. And if you look over at the Atlanta MSA, it's around 83%. Although the main focus is on the 30% AMI, it's also important to look at those individuals that are at or below the 15% AMI. And those are the individuals that are deemed deeply low income, and they also fit into the category of those that are 30% AMI. So over the course of this slide and the next slide, we'll take a look at the income levels that are produced by HUD. So if we look at the income levels, it's broken down by family size. So as the family size increases, so does the income limit. So if we look at a family of 4, in Georgia, the income limit is $17,900. In the Atlanta MSA, the income limit is $24,250. So when we take a look at this slide, we can show how the income limits are broken down. And this is basically how much the family and individuals are allotted on a monthly basis to pay for their housing expenses at 30% AMI. So if we go back to the family size of 4, in Georgia, this family is allotted $448, and within the Atlanta MSA, they're allotted $606. And then if you look down below, we're showing 1 bedroom at fair market rent and 2 bedrooms at fair market rent. Based on these numbers, this family of 4 will not be able to afford an apartment within Georgia or the Atlanta MSA. So this does not allow them to get a fair market rent apartment. Here, we're looking at the households in Georgia by income level. So based on this, we can see that 14% of the ELI households in Georgia are only about 500,000. So this is important because if we look at the VLI, these households account for 16%, but are also 580,000 households. Okay, so now that we've kind of looked at the Georgia ELI households, it's important to break down and look at the individuals. So persons aged 18 to 54 are the largest group within the ELI population. This group accounts for approximately 46% of the population and is roughly 530,000 individuals. And then we have the children under, well, the persons under age 18, which accounts for 34% of the population. From this, we can take that many of the households actually have children. And then the last category are the persons age 55 and over. And these only account for 20% of the population and are roughly 235,000 people. On this slide, we're able to see the ELI population by race as well as the total population in Georgia. From this, we can see that whites and blacks account for roughly 230,000 households within the ELI population. So when we compare this to Georgia, we can see that the population is disproportionate. Whites that are ELI account for 3.9% of the total Georgia population, while blacks that are ELI account for 7.6% of the total population in Georgia. Here we're looking at individuals that are 25 and older and considered to be ELI. The majority of ELI individuals have less than a high school diploma or a high school graduate or equivalent. Those two categories alone make up approximately 64% of the education attainment for those that are ELI. So from this, we can take that a lot of these individuals have low-paying jobs or minimum wage jobs that make it harder for them to afford housing at fair market rent. This slide here allows us to break down renter and homeowners based on the age of the head of household. So from this, we can see that the majority of renters within the ELI population are between 18 and 54. While the majority of homeowners within the ELI population are between the age of 55 and over. In comparison to the Georgia population, the 18 to 54 age range account for about 54% of the homeowners and 78% of the renters, while the age 55 and over account for 45% of homeowners and around 22% of all renters. This slide here breaks down the households within the ELI population that has someone that is disabled. So approximately 180,000 households, or 36%, has a member of the family that is deemed disabled. And approximately 64% have a household member that is not disabled. So now that we've briefly looked at the profile of the ELI population, it's important to now shift the focus to the affordable and available units within Georgia and the Atlanta MSA. From what we're seeing here, Georgia has less than the national level of affordable and available units for every 100 ELI households. So this means that Georgia has 28 affordable and available rental units for every 100 ELI households. And looking at the chart, Georgia currently has 224,000 available and affordable units at or below 30% AMI. But almost 500,000 people within Georgia are in need of housing at 30% AMI. This essentially shows the deficit in affordable housing within Georgia. Okay, Philip?
Great, thanks, Brittney. So something that you'll notice as Brittney goes through that research is that while we are certainly looking at quite a few different things, we are careful about making our assumptions and conclusions, because something we want to do through this public input process is ask our stakeholders, ask people around the state if this is the correct and complete data that we should be looking at. So we have a series of questions that I'd like to go through here, and the main purpose of these questions is to inform the dialogue, both the dialogue that we have today, but the ongoing dialogue that we're going to be having about the National Housing Trust Fund. So as I said before, we are certainly being careful about the conclusions we draw, because we want to hear from you and others first of, you should look at this data set, you may have missed this thing, we're not sure we agree with the data that you're using, because certainly there's conclusions that are implied or could be drawn from what Brittney worked through, but we want to start with sort of a shared understanding of the data and research that we're building this allocation plan on. So we'll certainly continue our opportunity for you to participate in this process through polling. I'll be interested and to be sending some of these around just to take a temperature of how people feel, and then we'll see if we can have any follow-up conversation as we go through these questions. So I'm going to go ahead and put up the first question, just in response to this general concept from what Brittney just reviewed. Do you feel as if DCA is really using the correct or complete data to be starting to think through this type of a program development? So I'll give you a minute or less than a minute to vote. Great, it looks like that's probably what we'll get. So I'll go ahead and close it there at 75% of votes, and we'll have some more opportunities. But as you can see on the screen now, certainly while there are many in support of the direction our research is going, we're seeing really 1 in 10 people saying that they don't think DCA is using the right or complete data. And really a couple things there, both the people who are saying, yes, we support the data, we welcome your input on some of the conclusions we should be drawing with that, some of the policy implications. And for those of you who do not think that DCA is taking the right focus, then we certainly would like to hear from you whether you think that the data we're using is incorrect or suspect, or whether or not there's areas that we are areas that we're not considering. And so we have a question in already. Does income source or employment status come into play at all, or can you measure that effectively? So we certainly appreciate that question. I think that's something that is important to consider, and we'll be taking that question and seeing if it is something that we can include in some of the research that we're doing or continuing to do. So I believe what I'll do is, if you have questions or comments, I certainly have the ability to open up some microphones as individuals raise hands, or you're welcome to submit questions. Otherwise, what I'll do is go through some of these questions that the DCA would like to see as framing some of the input, and then we'll sort of respond as we can. And then at the end, when we have open Q&A, we'll see if there's any more interest in dialogue there. There is a question that's also come in: what percentage of the ELI population are college students? I think that's certainly a helpful question for us as well. So we'll record that one and see what we can bring up with that as well. One more question that's come in. Are the income numbers computed somewhat analogous to how they'd be for tax credit or home compliance? Now, the research that we have done, and part of the reason why we're looking at, and some may ask why we're looking at 18 to 55 and 55 and up, is really looking at the different types of development that we've done, whether or not it's family-style housing or housing particularly or specifically set aside for seniors, which could either be housing for older persons, which is 55 and above, or senior housing, which I believe is 62 and above. And so to that end, we are looking at, to some extent, similar to some of our other programs. What about access to transportation, housing and transportation costs, and the impact to income? Shouldn't be more than 30% for housing and 15% for transportation. And that's a great point, and I think that's something that, as we're looking at the state, there's tools out there for housing plus transportation costs, and that's a good reminder for us to be taking those into consideration, because cost burden is not just a housing question. So thank you for that. There are persons who are not eligible to participate. Another question. I'm just sort of reading through questions since it seems like that's how people are comfortable submitting. There are persons who are not eligible to participate in federal housing programs. How is that considered? At this time, I think that we would certainly be open and interested to hearing the information that our stakeholders have on these populations and any input on how we can better measure and understand the need for housing amongst those who are not eligible to participate in federal housing. Is there separate rural and urban data? Currently, with what we're looking at, we have a little bit that can look at urban and rural, but I think that's helpful for us as well as we go through this. I appreciate the questions. I'm sure Brittney appreciates it. Sounds like she's going to have quite a bit to think about. I am going to, before clicking on the next question, note that there is a hand raised. I'm going to do my best, Verona, to unmute you and see if we can hear your question. I have you unmuted. See if you can go ahead and speak. All right, I think I got a sorry, so maybe we'll hold off on that one for now. All right. There's certainly quite a few questions in here, so I am going through those. Don't have a microphone, gotcha. What about the need to rehabilitate and modernize existing housing stock? Is that being assessed? And I think that's certainly a policy question that's coming through this process. The question as to should the National Housing Trust Fund be leveraged to create as much new housing units for the ELA populations as possible, or would we use it as a preservation tool? And I think we certainly would be interested in hearing input on that. And probably, as you'll hear me say throughout this process, we did very intentionally start to seek public input early in our process before we had answered all these questions. So some I may not be able to answer officially from DCA right now, but certainly think there's a value to talking through some of them, or at least noting the questions, and encouraging those on the call and others to be helping us try to answer some of these questions that come up. So another one, I think it would be advisable to drill down on disability data. What percentage AMI do people who rely on disability benefits fall into? People who meet in independent living programs are around 5% AMI. This has implications for the amount of federal subsidy needed vis-a-vis those at 25% AMI. I think that brings us to very helpful conversations about how can we try to go deeper into some of the research that we already have, in addition to expanding some of the research, expanding into new areas of research. Perhaps consider family size or number of children as an important data point, and we appreciate that as well. And I think that there's certainly already been a conversation around the need not just for 1- and 2-bedroom housing, but for housing that serves individuals or households that may need 3 or 4 bedrooms. And so I think that's a helpful conversation for us, and that's a conversation we'd certainly like to continue to hear input on. All right. So while this certainly may not be the best forum for back and forth, if there are attendees out there who are hearing some of those questions I'm giving and feeling like a little bit more dialogue would be valuable, please go ahead and raise your hand if you have microphone access, and we're certainly interested in hearing some of that input. Or, as you'll see later on, you're welcome to send it in an email or reach out to me and let me know if you or your organization is interested in participating in further calls or conversations. So with that, I'll move on, since we do have 6 kind of overarching questions that we're interested in. The second one here being, based on this or other research, should DCA prioritize a specific population group? And this is something I didn't talk about earlier in the ability of the National Housing Trust Fund. We certainly cannot discriminate based off fair housing rules and others, but we do have the ability to focus in on specific subpopulations of the ELI population, such as individuals experiencing homelessness, reentering citizens, individuals with disabilities, households, some of these other categories that I've listed. I should certainly be careful to make sure I'm following all fair housing categories when I'm putting this in here, but wanting to certainly use this to at least get the conversation started. I'm going to hide that first question then, and so you can see this second list of questions, and then I'll put up our next poll question, which is just getting an idea from those on the call who think that DCA should focus in on a specific population group, or if the National Housing Trust Fund should remain open to a pretty high or large diversity of ELI individuals. Give people a few more seconds to cast their votes. So I'll close it there and share our poll. It looks like we're fairly well split down the middle as far as those who believe DCA should focus in on a specific population group and those that should not. We've already gotten a question in, which is a fair question of, if we prioritize specific groups, are we risking running afoul of fair housing or Olmstead? And I think there's certainly a case to be made for the agency being mindful of the priorities we put in. And as I mentioned before, we cannot select a subgroup that infringes on fair housing rights. And so I'm even recognizing some of the ones I've listed on here could be sort of borderline in that conversation. But as far as prioritizing individuals with disabilities or individuals experiencing homelessness or some of the other priority categories that already exist in our consolidated plan, we do have the ability through this program to include that priority in whatever scoring or allocation plan we have. And then I think the conversation around Olmsted, thank you, Nathan, for that question, is one that continues to be at the forefront of our minds as far as the obligation we have to that agreement with any new funding source. So with that, I'll leave it open again for a minute as people may have interest in raising a hand or inputting any questions. And I'll sort of note here that we will certainly be saving and collecting these questions and kind of doing our best through the public input process to make sure we're addressing these different inputs and concerns. All right, Derek, I'm going to attempt to unmute you and see if that allows you to go ahead and talk. Let's try that one more time. Will you raise your hand again, Derek? It says you're self-muted. We'll give Derek another moment to see if he can unmute himself.
How about now?
Yes, excellent. Go ahead, Derek.
Great. You know, I'm thinking about the difficulties in housing people who just require one bedroom. Unlike family units where they can see a increase in the maximum subsidy allowed because of the bedroom units, the one-person households such as seniors and maybe homeless populations, they don't have that benefit of having extra subsidy because most of the products being provided are one bedroom, thus requiring us to have more subsidy in projects. Is there a way, I'm thinking this lends itself to the conversation of setting funding priorities that allow one household or one bedroom project some kind of priority?
So you're saying it would be helpful to look at whether or not there'd be a priority if developments will include more one bedrooms, or if the subsidy went towards prioritizing populations that tend to need one bedroom.
Prioritizing populations.
Gotcha. And I think that's in line with the conversation we're having here, certainly. And I think that's helpful information. And of course, while I value the conversational input back and forth, I'd encourage Derek and others as you're kind of thinking through these different reasons why one approach may make more sense than another, if you'd be willing to kind of send over an email with some of that as well.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm still on mute or not. One of the things
still. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things I'm thinking about is when it comes to actually being able to attract debt to a project. I mean, the more grant dollars allows for us to attract more debt to the project. So, for example, if we were looking at funding a supportive housing deal, and instead of us being capped with the grant dollars of $100,000, we were able to increase that grant amount to $120,000. There's an opportunity for us to get either more debt or vice versa.
Right. I think that's a helpful conversation. We're still waiting on guidance from HUD as far as subsidy per unit guidance that they're going to put out. But I think the conversation around maximum grants or low to no interest loans, depending on how this program ends up being structured, is a helpful conversation to dig into. I'm going to go ahead and mute you back unless there's something else you had at this stage. So I've also got a question in that it's hard to answer this question strictly yes or no, and I recognize it given the small size of this year's allocation. Prioritizing to a specific group may not be a bad idea, although we may not wish to set a precedent for future unless specific criteria are set. And I think that's a helpful input and certainly points to the nuance of some of the decisions that are being made in this first year. There's certainly a level where HUD has recognized this will be a new process for every state, and there will be some bumps along in that development, but William makes a good point that it will be a precedent-setting year. It's an important year in showing the value of the program. So we will be taking those considerations seriously. And I'll also note that while my questions are binary, we certainly recognize there's some gray area in between. So you can abstain from voting if you struggle with the binary aspect of it, but certainly appreciate input like this. So with that, I will go on to our third question that we're trying to frame in this process, which is really getting to an understanding of, is the National Housing Trust Fund even viable without other funding sources? The example I have up here is example property that was provided by a HUD consultant in a presentation on the trust fund, and really looking through a very similar to Atlanta median family income, estimating a three-person household around $20,000 of annual income, which would project a rent of around $500, and once you let utilities out of there, you're looking at a monthly rent of an ELI household at around less than $400, $381. And so you're looking at a unit rent potential, really in the best case scenario, no vacancies, no bad debt, no other issues that may come up, of less than $5,000 per year, specifically around, in this example, $4,572. When you look at standard operating costs for the same county that was used for this example, there was a $4,600 per unit per year cost, which in year one, with all the best possible estimates, that comes out as a negative $34 cash flow, which obviously, if you carry this out through the 30-year affordability period, is going to trend in a negative direction. That 44,000 should be in parentheses, because it would trend much further into the negative as costs outstrip rent or income increases. So really the question, and I'll go ahead and put our poll up as well for this one, is the National Housing Trust Fund viable without other funding, or is this something where I'll have to tie in to another program? And I'll give about a minute to vote on this one as well. Couple more seconds. So I'll go ahead and close it here, with the vast majority of people sharing that they really do not see this as a program that really could stand on its own without another, without connecting into another program as well. I would say for the couple people that did say they think that the National Housing Trust Fund funding could stand on its own, we would certainly be interested to hear your input on that and sort of the process that you'd be going through to see that outcome. And for those of you who do not see that as a possible standalone funding source, we're certainly interested and open to hearing what other programs make the most sense to be leveraging to serve this ELI population in a meaningful way with these funds. And I'll go ahead and move on to the next question, both in interest of time and because these are similar questions. So if the units still need rental assistance, assuming in many cases rental assistance would be that other form of subsidy that makes the ELI, National Housing Trust Fund, actually work, the question is, what has the National Housing Trust Fund accomplished? What can $1 million do, or if $1 million is put into a deal, but then rental assistance is still brought to bear to make it affordable, what is the overall value of putting that National Housing Trust Fund dollars in there? Then there's kind of a tandem question of, is there a possible route for the National Housing Trust Fund without rental assistance? And I'll hide our last poll so people can see that these questions that we have up here on the screen. And I'll go ahead and actually open up the next one because I'd be interested to hear what people would have to say as to whether this is something that could be structured in a way that is separate from some form of rental assistance, or if that's a non-starter. So I'll go ahead and stop it there. And seeing a similar outcome as sort of the last question, some saying, well, more towards, yes, it could be possible without rental assistance, many thinking that rental assistance is going to be a pretty important starting point. We've gotten the question written in that, of course, it depends. There may be what other funding sources are available and what the economics of the situation are. But it sounds like predominantly there's this thought that rental assistance would be necessary, and if rental assistance was not part of it, then certainly other sources would have to be brought to bear to help make the unit successful. So I really point out both of these questions, the question 3 and the question 4, because we want to get a better understanding, depending on how you bring rental assistance in. I think that a case could be made that if rental assistance is used or other subsidies are used, then the expectations on DCA's end would certainly increase if we're going to be layering subsidy on top of each other. Should we be looking to have or expect deeper targeting or other types of outcomes, or are those layered subsidies just what's necessary to be able to serve this population? So a question has come in as to whether or not the idea for a deal would be 100% ELI or extremely low income or not, or would it be mixed income? And Nathan is predicting question 6, but I think that we are certainly open to looking at different models that are out there. Some states have done smaller group homes to serve individuals with disabilities, which those would be 100% ELI, and then there's others that are looking at a tax credit program, which would be a very mixed income structure, and we're seeing things in between. So kind of as I mentioned earlier in this call, we are saving our assumptions or decisions till we get public input in these early stages, and then of course there will be opportunities for public input as we make those decisions. All right. So moving into question number 5, and we'll try to go ahead and I'll close out these last 2 questions somewhat quickly so that we can open up for any final questions or comments. Question number 5 is, how can DCA mitigate the 30-year compliance risk? Because honestly, as you are thinking through comments and thoughts and suggestions on how DCA should undertake this program, considering that 30-year compliance risk is going to be a major, major component. There's no proportional repayment. If we make it to year 29 on a $2 million grant and the project fails, then we owe HUD $2 million from non-federal funds. So DCA continues to carry a major risk throughout the 30-year period, which is going to put a heavy onus on us to be paying attention to how we structure the program on the front end, who we partner with, who we provide the funds to, because there's just such a long-term commitment. And in addition to that, there's no ability to reinvest National Housing Trust funds during that 30-year compliance period on the rental side. So once we give funds, those initial funds are the total trust funds that can be provided to a development. Kind of hand in hand, for those who are on the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, webinar and those who have heard some of the other advocacy areas around the National Housing Trust Fund, there's a push for a nonprofit preference. For a lot of, for a handful of reasons, certainly, of the interest and cause-driven focus for permanent or very long-term affordability, as well as some of the engagement with the populations that we're serving through this program. And one of the questions that DCA is certainly thinking through is what could we look at as an agency if such a preference were to be given? What extra measures or what understanding could we reach, or what could we ask for to help us get to a place where we've mitigated to the best of our abilities that 30-year affordability risk? So then I'll kind of jump to the last question so we can have any open conversation we want about everything that has been discussed or anything else. And the last question is, should DCA focus on small, mid, or large rental housing development? So input that would be very helpful for us is, what's the different relevant trust fund cost per unit? What would be sort of the bang for the buck on small, mid, or large rental housing development? What are the advantages of each type for those who would advocate for different areas in here, helping us understand how small rental, for instance, would operate in the long run or generate enough income? What other funding sources might be brought to bear to make those successful, if possible, or whether or not some of these other categories make more sense. And so the case being made across the board in these different categories would be helpful, which will bring me to the last poll that I have, which is just getting an idea or getting a temperature from those who are on the call if there's an opinion of how DCA should focus these National Housing Trust Fund resources, assuming we're looking early on certainly at rental housing. Is there a need to focus in on a specific subset of rental development? We're getting a little bit of polling exhaustion, less votes with each poll, but that's understandable. I'll go ahead and close that one there and share it to show that somewhat as expected, or keeping some flexibility on a combination of funding opportunities, but the certainly higher emphasis on small and mid-sized rental over large rental, with the recognition there that DCA certainly has funding sources such as the low-income housing tax credit and the way we use our home program to focus pretty specifically in on large rental. From here, I have a hand up, so I'm going to go ahead and let Pat have some input, and then we'll open up for general conversation. So I've unmuted you, Pat, if you can go ahead and see if we can hear you. While we give Pat time to see if that input is possible, I'll sort of move into our contact slides again so that you can see Brittney and I's information, and of course the bolded one at the bottom, certainly looking at the National Housing Trust Fund's email address. We do have a question in. Can the funds be used for multifamily eligible costs? Can be used as a guarantee? So there is the ability for a third of the funds to be used for operating expenses for rental housing. The rest of the funds will be focused in on much the same uses that you would see in the home program. And so to that end, I would believe that a guarantee would be possible, something that would have to be considered when looking at things like guarantees is the existing capacity or infrastructure at DCA to implement programs. As we currently don't have a home guarantee, it would be a somewhat extensive conversation as to whether or not we expand into new lending mechanisms. Pat, are you able to have some input? I'll go ahead and mute you then. So at this point, we certainly appreciate all the questions we've gotten in and some of the conversations that we're able to have. Like I said at the beginning of the call, I know a webinar is not exactly the most back and forth dialogue, and so please continue to share emails, reach out to us, and we're certainly willing to and interested in setting up calls as groups are interested. I'll sort of pause here with a few minutes left to see if there's anyone else who would like to either raise their hand or submit a question. Thank you for the person reminding me to hide my polls. I have now hidden the polls, and now you should be able to see the contact slide. All right, so hearing no more comments, I want to thank everyone for being on the call. I want to encourage you to reach out through NHTF, National Housing Trust Fund, at dca.ga.gov. Let us know where we need to hear more. Certainly let us know where we could be doing more or better research. And let us know if there's groups, populations, individuals out there that you don't believe has had a voice or is seeming to have a voice in this process. And we want to make sure that we want to connect with those individuals. So with that, thank you. We will stop the recording, share the recording. We'll probably post that on our website if any colleagues were unable to join. And from there, we'll just follow up as we're able.